I'm Michon Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. Invite historical drama fans you know to subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters wherever they enjoy their favorite podcast. Subscribers receive notifications about new episodes and bonus content.
Sign up for our newsletter on our webpage at michonbostonggroup.com/Boston Sisters or on our Instagram bio link at Historical Drama Sisters and receive news and announcements about upcoming podcasts and historical drama activities. Enjoy the podcast, and thank you for listening. Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. I'm Michon Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. Over the summer, we recommended to our social media followers and newsletter subscribers 4 historical dramas inspired by real-life events that continue to resonate as we approach one of the most consequential elections in U.S. history. Those historical dramas included the 2016 film Confirmation, about the testimony by Anita Hill at the 1991 Clarence Thomas Supreme Court nomination hearings, the 2014 film Selma, about the tumultuous 3-month period in 1965 when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led a dangerous campaign to secure equal voting rights with the epic Montgomery to Selma March that resulted in passing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Suffragette, the 2015 film about women in the UK in the early 20th century who risked everything in a fight for the right to vote, and Shirley, the 2024 biopic of Brooklyn, New York Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm. We chose Shirley as the focus for this podcast conversation. Not only is Shirley a window to the past, but for the 2024 election year, the film is a very relevant mirror of the present. Shirley tells the story of the first Black Congresswoman and political icon Shirley Chisholm and her trailblazing run for President of the United States. It chronicles her audacious, boundary-breaking 1972 presidential campaign. The film features Oscar winner Regina King as New York Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm and is written and directed by Oscar-winning filmmaker John Ridley. Shirley is co-produced by John Ridley, Regina King, and her sister Raina King, and Participant Media. Shirley is streaming on Netflix.
Our guest for this conversation is Dr. Zinga A. Fraser. Dr. Fraser is a foremost expert on Shirley Chisholm and Black congressional women and Black feminist politics and culture. She served as the historical consultant for the Netflix feature Shirley. Dr. Zinga A. Fraser is the director of the Shirley Chisholm Project on Brooklyn women's activism and an assistant professor in the Africana Studies Department and Women's and Gender Studies program at Brooklyn College. Before entering academia, Dr. Fraser was a legislative assistant on Capitol Hill to former Congressman Major R. Owens, who succeeded Shirley Chisholm after her retirement. Dr. Fraser's book, Shirley Chisholm, in her own words, a collection of speeches and writings published this fall by the University of California Press, explores Chisholm's intellectual legacy. In her introduction, Dr. Fraser writes, although Chisholm is known for her catchphrases like unbought and unbossed and catalyst for change, she is not associated with a singular defining speech like Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, Malcolm X's Bullet or Ballot, or even Barbara Jordan's 1972 Watergate speech. Yet she remains one of the nation's most inspiring orators and a figure who made a generation revise their dreams and rethink possibilities that they believed were out of reach. Dr. Fraser is currently completing her book manuscript titled Sister Insider, Sister Outsider, Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan, Black Women's Politics in the Post-Civil Rights Era. She is also the co-curator for Shirley Chisholm at 100, Changing the Face of Democracy, the first major museum exhibition on the life and legacy of Shirley Chisholm at the Museum of the City of New York that opened in June 2024. You can read more about Dr. Zinga A. Fraser on our webpage for this podcast and purchase her book, Shirley Chisholm, in her own words, speeches, and writings, using the link that takes you to the podcast affiliate bookstore. Your book purchases support this podcast and independent booksellers. Welcome, Dr. Fraser, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Thank you so much.
How did you learn about Shirley Chisholm, and what motivated you to dedicate your scholarship to her?
Well, I heard about Shirley Chisholm from my mother, who was actually named Shirley. She was a medical technologist in Brooklyn, New York. And she is in the National Museum of African American History. She's in a picture with Shirley Chisholm because Shirley Chisholm picketed with a number of union workers, hospital workers in Brooklyn. And so my mother always spoke of the importance of her activism, who was also a former SNCC member as well. And my mother talked about the importance of Black women in politics and how important Shirley Chisholm was to the district, what's to the world in which we inhabited. So, I grew up knowing who she was, seeing pictures of her. Her books were in my mother's library. And so it's ironic that those little seeds, and I didn't know what that was. I just knew, oh, that was the first Congresswoman. That was a woman who ran for the president. But I never thought about her maybe in high school, right? Until I got into graduate school, or actually before graduate school, working with Congressman Owens. I realized my decision to do and study African American people and their life and their history, that no one really spoke about Shirley Chisholm. And I had the books. There wasn't a documentary at that time. And I just thought that it was very odd that she was such a monumental figure. There were very limited scholarly pieces on Shirley Chisholm. And there wasn't a public remembrance of Chisholm during that time, even in the district that I grew up in, right? There weren't any monuments that there are now, right? There weren't any streets named after Shirley Chisholm or post office or any monuments that really talked about who she was. And she wasn't a part of the conversation, even when I was on the Hill, beyond, her being the most significant district person, right? But there wasn't any conversations by young people or even some of the elders talking about Shirley Chisholm's legacy. So it kind of became full circle of, being a child reared in Brooklyn, with her mother and father who were activists as well as educators. And Chisholm was, as well as herself, an educator, that I decided to devote a lot of the work that I do on propelling her legacy.
And I'm glad you did, because so many times we usually start, or should I say, stop at first.
Yeah.
First Black Congresswoman, first Black woman to run for President of the United States. So let's talk about the film, the biopic. You were involved with that. What was your contribution to the film, Shirley? How were you involved in the creative process? How did that go?
Well, it was amazing. And I still feel like I'm doing a lot of the work. I'm still working with Regina and Raina. I mean, I was in the beginning stages, and understand this was happening, during COVID. We had conversations prior to COVID, and then COVID happened and shut, of course, a lot of things down. But I was in the beginning stages. There was a script that was already done. I had met with Raina first, and then I met with Regina and John. And so I did everything from script development and discussing and making sure that all of the historical facts were indeed facts. Even though it's a biopic, everything is not as it happened in history, because that's just not how movies are made. Right. And
Yes.
so it's not a documentary, and it's not a long trajectory of Chisholm's born to she's, you know, to her
Birth to earth, as they
Earth to
said.
earth, yeah, right. Cradle to grave, as Regina will
Yeah.
always say, right? A cradle to grave story. And it only looks at the 72 and thinking about how they created a narrative that allowed people to engage in that history, but also have a compelling personal story of Shirley Chisholm. So I did all of that work. And then during the production, advising, I actually worked with Regina in terms of getting the accent together. So she came down, to New York, and we've met, and I had her meet other Bayesian American older women that were of the same age of Shirley Chisholm, and we did that. She also had a coach that was in LA. We met a couple of times. I actually brought John and Regina to the archive that we have at the Shirley Chisholm Project at Brooklyn College, so they were able to see, some of the archival pieces that we have, and review some of those things, as well as going to other libraries and other places that, had some of the likeness of Chisholm. And so working with them on that, and then working on the pre-development stages. And then lastly, once the film was released, doing what we consider to be a campaign around the film, getting people out to go to the film, and doing all the kind of press work, working with participants a lot as well, and giving them informations of not only about Chisholm, but the political process, to be shared on their social media accounts and that nature, and working with the unveiling of the film with Regina and John and the rest of the cast that was done in DC. We did DC, New York, and then LA for the big premiere.
Wow.
Yeah. That's a lot.
Oh,
Really
yeah.
involved. Really involved.
So you
Yeah.
do the kind of work I've been doing, impact producing.
Yes,
And
and it was an amazing opportunity. People who want to get it right. And I know that may not be the majority of people, but Royal Ties and John, they were so committed in having a certain kind of integrity for the film, and also, making sure that it got to the masses of people. And so it was just an honor to really work with everyone on the team.
well, speaking of getting it right, and this came up just before yesterday, before we're talking today, uh, using film in the classroom. Well, let's say take Shirley as an example. What can a narrative film like this one, and maybe some of the others we mentioned in the introduction, bring to the classroom and sparking curiosity and understanding about history? I mean, do you use film in your classes or courses?
I definitely do. I mean, it provides, we are of a digital age. The students that we teach they aren't just going to read a book. It doesn't come alive for them in the ways in which I think a number of us were raised, right? And so that audio visual of understanding that political moment. So that first scene in Shirley, where she's running up the stairs on Capitol Hill, and she's the only Black woman, right? And it looks at the whole sea of white men, right? And also the stats that show how many women were in Congress when she was there. It resonates to students beyond just reading it in a book. It resonates visually to them. And so I use film to reinforce the writings that I do. I use the documentaries as well as the feature films, especially the ones that are done right, like this film, to expose a young and an older generation what I can't do in a textbook or in a lecture is to make you feel the way in which Shirley Chisholm felt when Regina King is showing her being accosted, and the life and death things that happened to Shirley Chisholm on the campaign. I can't make you feel that. I can't make you see the frustration in Chisholm by not having certain constituencies support her. That dramatic expression of film allows that to hunker at and connect, whether you're Black or you're white or whatever ethnic or racial makeup, or if you're a woman or you're a man or you're transgender, you can see the humanity. And the film allows you to see the humanity in Shirley Chisholm. And what I thought was so brilliantly done by John in terms of the ways in which he wrote the film, but also how brilliantly done by Regina in terms of her execution of letting us see Chisholm and not just see her,
Yes.
was that Black women up until now, and there are very few films that allow Black women, political women, to have a breath of who they are. Not only is Chisholm seen as strategic and smart and bright, but also her empathy, allowing us to see the full humanity of Black womanhood that we never really get to see in a lot of films. And that this film allows us to connect to people. And I think it's a universal framework that people are able to see her empathy and her drive and her rigor, that is inspiring to, a number of us until multi generations.
And there's one little, what actors call the bit, that made her relatable, I would say, was the strawberry shakes.
Yeah, the
It's a
McDonald's,
it's a
right?
little thing, but it had a
Yeah.
lot. There was a lot in that.
Yes, and it was. And they did painstakingly, met with people and interviewed people who knew Shirley, and we worked with, the estate and some of the family members. She loved her food, but also in the beginning, I tell people all the time and students, I'm like, Chisholm loved to dance. Right? Like the same conversations, and I know we'll talk about some contemporary things, right? But the same conversations that people are saying about Kamala's laugh, right? Or how
Mhm,
scary her
mhm.
laugh is, but not allowing us, like, why can't a Black woman laugh, right? But the same ways in which we think about Shirley Chisholm, who loved to dance and loved to express herself in that way. Music was so important to her, whether she was on the piano, and she also wrote poetry. So all of those things are about humanizing people, that they aren't just these, stern, firm people. Of course she was, right? But she was also a very warm and empathetic and compassionate and loving person. And so a film allows us to have that conversation and then engage and even view these women that way. So now that we can be in the present moment, when we look at a Cori Bush, or we look at a Kamala Harris and others, VP Harris, that we can see the humanity in who these people and individuals are, besides just being politicians and government officials.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So we've just talked about the power of film, and as someone who has a theater background and who appreciates, when you can bring like multiple senses to storytelling. At the same time, there is a richness to those of us who also grew up in the analog age with books. And we've also seen how books can drive people to films, but also films and dramatic series can drive people to books. And certainly, having seen the biopic Shirley, I am definitely very much wanting to read your book and appreciate it. You're sharing the introduction with us before its publication. And in that introduction, to your book, Shirley Chisholm in Her Own Words, Speeches, and Writings, which is being released in the fall of 2024, you express your intention of providing, quote, insight into the complexities that exist at the intersection of race, gender, class, and American democracy, especially for Black women in electoral politics. And you've talked about just now showing the humanity and the three dimensionality of Shirley Chisholm. What other impact are you hoping this book will have? And is there a particular audience that you want to be reading this book?
I mean, I think I want the impact, and the reason why I guess I couldn't come up with I mean, maybe I could have come up with a better title. But it was because I felt like I've read a number of things that people have written on Chisholm. And I really always tell my students it's nothing better than the source. And the reason why I was painstakingly went through hundreds of, speeches and writings is because I wanted people to know Chisholm on her own terms. I think what happens is, and the reason why I'm a fan of books, right? Is that Chisholm and understanding people in their own voice allows us to get to cut away through others' perceptions. Yes, I'm a studier. I'm an archivist of Chisholm. I do the work and the painstaking research. And I have another book coming out on Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan. It's a comparative study of
Wow.
Black women's politics in the post-civil rights era, right? But the reason why this book is so important is, and because every section literally is divided for a number of people, but divided into sub things. Chisholm is writing about criminal justice, right? She's writing about education. There's a whole section on women's rights. She's writing about race and civil rights. She's not this one hit wonder, right? That we usually kind of attribute her. And so I think that the book allows people to literally deal with Chisholm on her own terms, make their own assessment of who she was, and the ways in which she expressed herself. The most important kind of framing that I do in the introduction is to think of Chisholm as an intellectual, a Black feminist intellectual. In many ways, we only place Black electoral or activists as activists, right? So someone who's on the ground, but she's a thinker.
Yes.
She's engaging text. She's reading Black feminists from Nikki Giovanni to Frances Bill to Toni Morrison. She's a lover of the arts. She's engaging in all of those things. All of those things make her a better politician, make her a better strategic politician. And so I want people to understand how intellectual she was, and not erase that from, when we think of Black intellectuals of the time, we only really think about the men, right? And so it provides a rejection of the masculinist narrative that we can look at the Black men who were congressional members, or even when we think about Obama, people think of him as an intellectual, but we never ever have that same conversation, in particular to the Black women who are in politics and who are, holding office during the time in which they emerge, especially someone like Shirley Chisholm.
Right. And we often lose also the fact that many Black women in movement were political strategists.
Yes, definitely.
And as well as organizers.
Exactly.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Visit our webpage at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters. Share this podcast. Join our historical drama community by signing up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future episodes and bonus content.
Now, back to our podcast conversation.
So, Dr. Fraser, on our podcast, we see our conversations and these films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. You just shared some of the themes, issues that Shirley Chisholm was writing about, speaking about during her lifetime, during her political career. And, it's a window on our political history, our nation's political history. But aren't there a lot of things about her life that you're thinking, this is like deja vu. We're still here. Can you talk a bit about that? Some of those things that seems to have extended themselves for the past 50 years and we're still grappling with.
Well, what I think the most, especially in this particular moment that we're in, and I'm writing an op-ed about it, is that, when Chisholm emerges in 72, it's an electrifying moment. It's electrifying because you have the peace movement that is operating and existing during that time. Young people are being the first able to vote for the president in 72. You have a women's right and liberation movement that is existing and at its apex in 72. You have all these women groups that are forming and mobilizing themselves. And then we have a Black Power movement that is operating for a number of Black intellectuals, politicians, elected officials, as well as just lay, whole communities who are trying to mobilize around racial injustice and inequities. And so Chisholm is operating in this kind of vacuum in so many ways. And what I see happening, they are also advocating and trying to create a coalition against an imperial president, right? They are trying their best to fight against Nixon and the war that is existing in the Vietnam. And I find it very kind of similar that in many ways, 72 was about what democracy people wanted to have. And this is before Watergate, but it was really also about having a corrupt president. And so when we're in this political moment, when we have someone who is running for president again without and believing like Nixon believed that he should rule without impunity, and that because he was president, he had the ability to discredit people, to persecute people in any way that he saw fit. But what's also different, and that's why history is so important, is that there were some strongholds against Nixon. And thank goodness history showed us that we don't have to have an imperial presidency, that there was actually at a time where a Republican Party actually stopped Nixon and said that we would not support Nixon with his ability to, they forced him to what? To decide to resign from office. And so we're in a moment where that is not the case, right? We have a Republican Party who is not operating as a soul of the country or for the best interests of a country. And I'm not being partisan in that. I'm just stating the facts in terms of saying that because you have done criminal acts, you have written yourself out of history and you have written yourself out of the office. And we think that it's important for us to uplift the country and guard the country for someone in that nature, right? Who operates in that nature. And so I think that's a great mirror to say that it wasn't, unfortunately, we have regressed in many ways in terms of holding our leadership accountable in this country. But we can also say that the mirror also shows us that we also have a progress. When we think about Chisholm going to the National Convention in 72 and taking that, standing on that podium, no Black woman until months ago, right, had ever been on that podium, right? Not in 2000s, not in the 90s. No Black woman stood there as a candidate for the presidency. And that's significant and monumental. And now we are at a point where we have Black women, everyday Black women, who are the reason why Kamala is vice president, right? And the reason why hopefully she will become president is because Black women, especially Black congressional women in particular, forced the Biden administration when he was running, you have to have a Black woman as a VP. If they did not strategically operate and exist in that way, we may not be in the position that we are in now. And so to see an entire group and delegation and people from all over this country get behind Kamala Harris, in spite of all this framework of race and gender, and support her because they believe in democracy, I think is a monumental time, as well as a connection to Chisholm's historic, her historic presidential run.
It's interesting because I feel that Chisholm's legacy is reflected in this moment. Here was someone, because I read one of her writings, The Good Fight, which is about her 1972 run for the presidency, but it's about more than that. It's also about how to engage politics strategically. As you said, she was an intellectual, she was a strategist, and she was talking about how you use your voting blocks. And you just mentioned Black women in Congress pushing to have a Black woman vice president, but also work in coalitions. And one of the things she said, and I'm paraphrasing, is that basically politics is doing the best you can working with imperfect people in an imperfect world.
Yes.
Do you really believe that you had to engage within the system? So, what do you regard as her legacy, particularly in terms of looking at leadership in this time that we're in?
Well, in many ways, it's what you said, right? Her being a strategist. Chisholm believed that, and she understood that coalition politics was probably one of the only ways in which marginalized and oppressed people who could obtain the reins of power. And Chisholm is invested in engaging and making sure that marginalized people have power. And so she's working across the aisle, but she's also saying, how do we bulldoze our way to better education, right? How do we ensure that women have the right to choose, when many in her community saw a support of abortion and reproductive justice as genocide to the Black race, right? I think in many ways, the thing that Chisholm does more than anything else is really show what it means to be unbought and unbossed, not as in the slogan, but as a political ideology. And that she is ensuring and really providing a model and an example to other politicians of how to really operate within a certain kind of political integrity, and to be focused and strategic about using her political power and aligning with people that allow her to gather those reins of power. And so we see that in her ability to get funding for WIC, right? Her decision to also have an intersectional framework of saying, you know what, we need to support domestic workers. No one is writing legislation to address that constituency. We need to write legislation that addresses and it deals with a way to address education. When she's in the New York State legislature, she's writing legislation that addresses retention for minority youth. And that still operates today. There are students who are in the CUNY system that are beneficiaries of the SEEK program. And that's all legislation from Chisholm. They may not even know who Chisholm is, but her legacy still continues by ensuring that Black and Brown, in particular, students have the resources, but also the mentorship to sustain themselves in colleges and universities.
And for our listeners who may not be familiar with WIC, could you
Oh, it's the way in which we receive funding for children as well as their nutritional value. So food stamps, all of those things come under that purview of WIC.
So, when we talk with our guest, we always ask a question or two related to the theme of the podcast, but it's also personal to the guest. And Dr. Fraser, I want to just acknowledge you have been through a lot of material, because Shirley Chisholm even says most of her campaign speeches for when she was running for president were extemporaneous. She did not write them down. So I know you were probably like listening also to and transcribing a lot as well. But given all that you have learned about Shirley Chisholm through your parents, through your research, through the film process, and I think you've also worked on the exhibition,
Yes.
Lifting Up Her Life. If you could go back in time, And maybe it isn't related to Shirley Chisholm, but if it were, if you could go back in time, when and where would you want to bear witness and why?
Hmm. I think in many ways it would be it's a twofold between Chisholm and Jordan. I wanna do
I understand, yes.
uh, um, I want to be with Chisholm when she runs in 72 and her conversations at the Democratic convention and her engagements with that Black constituency because there were only but so many people who were in the room, and so I would love to have been there, as well as I want to be with Barbara Jordan in 1976 when she is writing her speech, ironically, around the impeachment of Richard Nixon. I've read all of the things, I've looked at everything she wrote, every piece of paper, but I would love to be in the room of her kind of conceptualizing how she thought about what her speech would do, and then her reaction of it. So those are the two kind of political moments that I think I appreciate you giving me the ability to put them together. But those are the moments that I wish I was a part of, just to ask a couple of questions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
I
wonder if
hear that.
I wonder if she had writer's block.
Well, she did. She talks about, Barbara Jordan in particular talks about going to see the Constitution because it was so much a part of her speech. And I just, and also listening and seeing it, of course, I've watched it numerous of times, but also just being in Houston and seeing people said when they heard Barbara Jordan speak as if they were listening to God. And you don't hear that. You don't hear someone talk about a Black woman in the 1970s, and that connection. So she was such a brilliant writer too, and she wrote a lot. She even wrote actually more than Shirley Chisholm, ironically. But she was a lawyer as well, right? And so both women are continue to fascinate me. Oh, even all the years that I've been doing this, and it's over 15 years now that I've been working on these women. They continue to create new questions, and I have moments of frustration, but tons of laughter in addition
Yeah.
to it. Yeah.
Well, maybe someone will do a biopic of Barbara Jordan.
Yeah, we're kind of yeah, that's a new thing on the horizon. So hopefully.
Yeah, and we'll look forward to your, book as well.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Yeah, we'll have to have you back.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Fraser, for joining Taquina and me in this conversation about Shirley and so much more. The life and legacy of Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm. And now we're probably are going to be back again with Barbara Jordan, should
Yes,
that biopic happen.
definitely. Thank you so much.
Shirley, the biographical film featuring Regina King as Shirley Chisholm, the first Black Congresswoman and political icon, and her trailblazing run for President of the United States in 1972, is streaming on Netflix. Subscription fees will apply.
Purchase Dr. Zinga A. Fraser's Shirley Chisholm in Her Own Words, Speeches and Writings, and other books related to this podcast from our affiliate bookstore. Go to our webpage at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters and click on the affiliate bookstore link. Your book purchases support the podcast and independent booksellers.
And while you're on our webpage, sign up for the e-newsletter to stay up to date on new podcasts, bonus episodes, and historical drama-related activities. Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters wherever you enjoy your favorite podcasts. Leave a review. Give us 5 stars. Share this podcast with someone you know who will enjoy the conversation.
Follow us on Instagram at Historical Drama Sisters and on Facebook at Historical Drama Boston Sisters. Like and share Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your social media.
This is Michon Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast about historical films and series dramas. Visit our webpage at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters.
Tell us what historical dramas you're watching. Who knows? We may do a show about it. Sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the podcast, and share it with the people you know who binge on historical drama.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michon Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michon Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michon Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston. Thank you for listening.